So, what are we here for today? This is, oh my God, yes, absolutely. Hello and welcome. This is the final talk in the Rhetoric of Story course. I have been all over the world to give these talks, and now I'm back where I began, on the island of Bali, an island and a culture with a fantastic history of storytelling in and of itself. Hello, hello and welcome to the Rhetoric of Story and to the final talk in our course so far. We've been through an exciting series of talks looking at the fundamentals of compelling and engaging storytelling. And when we talk about story here, we're talking about story in any form. So this might be writing a novel, it could be making a film, it could be writing scripts for the stage. It might also be story in a variety of other settings. Where else do we find story? We find story in advertising. Every single advertisement you see is a little miniature story. We find story in business writing, if you're trying to communicate what it is that your business does to the world. In fact, stories are just tremendously important. Our whole world runs on stories. How do we understand what's going on in the world? We turn on the news and the news tells us stories about the world. How do we understand the country that we live in? We know about the history, the story of our country, and that's how we understand. How do we know what's going on in our own lives? Well, we tell a story about our own lives, and this is the core of the rhetoric of story. It's about understanding what makes these stories work, what makes them compelling, and what makes them immersive, what creates the effect that we are for a time inside the story that we are watching or that we're being told. At the heart of the rhetoric of story are 7 foundational elements of story. We have in the previous talk been through the first 6 of these. We've considered the idea of change. There is no story without a true and profound change around which the story turns. And this might be a huge dramatic change in the world. It might be a war won or lost by one side or another. It can also be a much smaller and more intimate change. It might be about simple things, how we grow up, how we go from a young person to an adult, how we achieve success in the world, or how we grow old. These are the changes that story is truly about. Following change, what is at the heart of every story? A self. There's a person, a hero, a protagonist that we follow at the heart of the story, and it's this self through whose eyes and ears and senses that we pick up all of the details of the story. What is there around the self? There are others. There are the characters who surround the hero at the heart of the story. And these others tend to fall into archetypes, the friends that help, the enemies and villains that get in our way. After these others in the story, we have conflict, the forces of antagonism, which make the hero's journey, the story that we are telling, hard and conflict-ridden. And again, these might be external forces, like an old man fighting against the sea to haul a fish back to the coast, or they might be internal, like the internal forms of resistance that we face every day to get up and go to work or look after our kids. These first 4 are the engine of the story. Following that are 2 more the external shape of the story that we're telling, events. Every story is made of a series of events, and that these events follow an order of cause and effect. One event leads to another in the telling of the story. The events that the story is made of are formed into a structure, and the structure of the story is bigger than the story itself. we find structures in the story that we love and admire. The most common, the 3-act structure, which shapes most plays, nearly all Hollywood films, many novels and other forms of storytelling as well. The beginning, middle, and end of the story, the opening exposition, the central conflict, and the final resolution of the story. These are the 6 elements of compelling storytelling that we've examined so far. Today we're going to be talking about the 7th and final foundational element of storytelling. This is to story as the ability to fly and jump over tall buildings is to Superman. The 7th of these elements is the secret superpower of storytelling. That's why we've left it until last. What is the 7th of the 7 foundational elements of storytelling? It is emotion. Let's think back briefly to the great Greek philosopher that we started these series of talks with in the Rhetoric of Storytelling, and that is Aristotle. In his writing about Greek theatre, Aristotle defined one quality above all else that we are seeking in a storytelling experience. That quality he called catharsis. And catharsis is quite simple to understand, and it's really about emotion. Aristotle illustrated catharsis with the simple story of a man fighting a lion. And let's consider this for a moment, as Aristotle did. If you were really fighting or possibly running from a lion, you would feel intense fear. The emotion of fear would completely dominate your entire experience of the world for that time. But you wouldn't be able to think. So you'd be having a very intense emotional experience, but you'd have no opportunity to consider it. Much later, you might think about what it might be like to fight a lion. And this consideration would be entirely logical. You wouldn't really understand the emotions at the heart of the experience. And so Aristotle said, story and the quality of catharsis give us the ability to experience both of these at the same time. Whilst we're watching a play about a man fighting a lion, we feel the intense emotional experiences, but not so powerfully that we aren't able also to think and consider what it is about this experience that is so powerful and possibly transformative. And through the combination of our logical thinking mind and our emotional feeling mind, we're able to reach a moment of catharsis. We're able to purge ourselves of the fear that we experience when considering the idea of being eaten alive, or when considering other fearful ideas. We're able to purge ourselves of the emotion of fear that we feel when we think about being eaten by a lion. And this experience of catharsis is tremendously valuable because we experience fear all of the time, experience other emotions like love, hatred. These emotional experiences drive us through our lives, and story helps us to better understand them through the effect that Aristotle called catharsis. Greek culture had a number of ways of considering emotion. They were bound up with the idea of time. The Greeks had 2 words for time. One was chronos, and it's where we get the word from, chronological time. And this is how we generally consider time today, that there are a series of events that follow each other one after another. And of course, chronos has a major part to play in storytelling. But the Greeks also had another way of considering time, and this was the idea of kairos. And kairos was emotional time. And you'll understand this, I'm sure, because you will all have had the experience of feeling an intense emotion. And instead of experiencing time flowing normally around you, you become more internalized, you feel the emotion, and you remember all of the other times that you have also experienced this emotion. So perhaps it's the emotion of loneliness, and you find yourself as an adult alone somewhere in the world. And you remember the time that as a child you were perhaps separated from your parents, and for the first time you felt intense aloneness, that emotional experience. And this is kairos. This is the way that we perceive the world through our emotions. In our fascinating match with our scientific understanding of both time and emotion today, we find that through the study of the brain through neuroscience and through our understanding of human personality and behavior through psychology, we also consider two different forms of time and emotion and experience. One of these is our logical, symbolic mind, which understands things rationally. And the other is our emotional and social consciousness that understands things through our emotions. And this is really hardwired into our brain. There's a part of our brain which evolved to think logically, and there's a part of our brain which evolved to give us information about the world emotionally. Crucially, this information is tied to other people. It's tied to our sense of self and our sense of